Hey, good to see you everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a history enthusiast, and a lifelong lover of Age of Empires. And in this series, Theory Crafting, I take a look at some of the civilizations, units, and similar not yet available in AoE2, and give my best shot at coming up with a design that could be hypothetically addable to the game at some point in the not terribly distant future. If this is your first time here, welcome. If this is not your first time here, welcome back. This build is coming to us from another fantastic commenter suggestion, in this case coming from Leif Calderay. Thank you so much for your suggestion, Leif. You had a lot of very good ones in here. A couple of the others I'll be definitely tackling in the future. But in this case, we'll be focusing on the final suggestion you gave in this lovely comment, namely the Zapotecs. This will be my first ever Mesoamerican civilization theorycraft, and in it I have some potentially controversial overhauls to Mesoamerican civilizations in general that I'm hoping will introduce enough strategic and tech tree diversity to accommodate for more civilizations besides the three that are there now, without them feeling redundant and piling on top of each other. For disclaimers on these builds and some of the philosophies that I follow in designing, take a look at the screen right now. If you'd like to see a comprehensive civilization document, take a look in the links down in the description. It'll give you all the nitty-gritty details if you're the kind of person like me who likes to see the actual numbers behind things. And with all that being said, let's jump headlong into an analysis of Zapotec history. As with many Mesoamerican civilizations, is often incomplete. There's definitely a lot of bad history out there surrounding these people, so let's jump into it. The Zapotecs settled in the Oaxaca Valley, and their civilization goes way back. 500 BC is when we first see evidence of Zapotec civilization. During this period, they were one of the few developed powers in the area and quickly established themselves as a major hub for trade, culture, and also religious thought. There were only a couple of rivals to them at the time, but they gained massive wealth from controlling the trade routes from the Olmecs to the rest of Mexico and vice versa, and they were so influential in the religion of the general area that the great city of Teotihuacan had a designated sector solely for individuals of Zapotec ethnicity that took up almost a quarter of the entire city. That's not to say the Zapotec religion was identical to the others in the region, but it definitely was a major part of what laid the groundwork for the religions that later rose. And the Zapotecs capitalized on this great influence and wealth to make some major expansions in the area. But these major expansions seem to have largely stopped around 100 to 200 AD and definitely stopped around 250. It was at this point that the Zapotec peoples consolidated their gains and started laying lots of defensive groundwork. Walls started going up in almost all of their cities and settlements, and from what can be seen in the archaeological record, they retained control of these settlements for a very, very long time. 900 AD marks the beginning of the Zapotec decline, though, as will soon be indicated, decline is perhaps a slight exaggeration of what actually happened, because they were still very powerful during this period. Around the 900s, a bunch of different resource wars started to spring up. Mexico was starting to become depleted around this time, and as such, a whole lot of the different Mexican peoples started seeking greener pastures, and the Zapotecs had quite a few such pastures, and as such, they started having to play defensive even more. They even established a new capital at the city of Mitla. They called it Leoba. The name Mitla is Nahuatl in origin, the Aztec language, and literally means place of rest. And this is because Mitla was one of the most important religious centers in all of Mexico, containing these colossal catacombs that were frequently opened, indicating that the Zapotecs practiced regular ancestor worship in a very literal way, perhaps even exhuming bodies to do so. And so, despite the resource wars, the Zapotecs were doing very, very well, with Monte Alban as their political hub and Mitla as their religious and cultural hub. That being said, new powers started to rise, and with them came an even greater crisis in Mexico writ large. That being a mega drought, which according to the archaeological record, seems to have occurred around 1350. This seems to have driven massive migrations of desperate Mexican peoples who, instead of just seeking greener pastures, were banging on the doors of Zapotec lands demanding to be let in. This led to the Zapotecs having to cede a little bit of ground for one of the first times in their existence, as well as founding their third capital, Zaachila, which was actually built in the middle of a lake. Sound familiar? In addition to all that, of course, they also encountered another great rival, those being the Mixtecs. The Mixtecs were one of the most fearsome peoples that the Zapotecs had yet faced, and were one of the few who actually gave them a run for their money. But despite all of this opposition, the Zapotecs still managed to hang on to the vast majority of their land holdings during this time frame. That is until the Aztecs emerged in around the 1400s AD. The Aztecs initially were not a massive threat to the Zapotecs because they were separated by, a couple hundred miles. But over time, they came into conflict with the Zapotec cities to their southwest, and eventually this led to all-out war. The Aztec king Ahuitzotl managed to land a number of staggering defeats against the Zapotecs between 1497 and 1502, eventually leading to the Zapotecs being conquered, or at least made tributary, for the first time in their entire imperial existence. A record of about 2,000 years, which should give you an idea of just how powerful and indomitable these guys were during the vast majority of their lifespan. But that's not to say that the Zapotecs were gone for good. In fact, something else happened around the 1500s that gave the Aztecs a whole lot more to worry about. That being a couple assholes in boats who landed on Aztec shores and started saying, "We'd like your gold, please." This was watched from a distance with some interest by the Zapotecs, and when it became clear that the Spanish were a serious threat, the Zapotecs, instead of trying to fight them, tried to placate them and play the diplomacy game. This kind of worked for maybe a decade, and then it did not work, and it's not entirely clear why, but eventually there was a war. The Spanish conquered the Zapotecs and began to impose a martial law upon them, although at the same time trying to convert them to Catholicism and to be subjects of the Spanish crown. This was not very successful. It was not entirely successful in most places in Mexico, but the Zapotecs were particularly resistant to it. They launched a great many rebellions even as Spanish power grew, mostly during the 1500s, but even as late as the 1700s. But by this point, the Spanish were just too dominant, and so it absolutely wasn't going to happen. And as such, historians tend to agree that the last remnants of Zapotec civilization, as it was known, were stomped out by the Spanish around 1550s AD. Though the Zapotec peoples are still a mainstay of southwestern Mexico. From what I remember, about 80,000 people today can call themselves Zapotec and still speak Zapotec languages. So even though their empire was destroyed, the Zapotecs still endure as a people even to this very day. A shorter history section than usual, probably because of the dearth of civilizations at play. Someday, I promise you, this map is going to be covered with all sorts of colorful heraldry to represent all of the different Mesoamerican civilizations, but that's not going to happen until I can do a couple more Meso Theorycrafts. In the future, my friends, in the future. Let's move on to flavor. In my implementation of the Zapotecs, they would obviously have Mesoamerican architecture, and they would have unique skins for the university and the castle. The university is a very important building to the Zapotecs. We'll get to why in a second. Their language would be Isthmus Zapotec, Xitalsha, ladies and gentlemen. For their wonder, I think the only choice is the Temple of Monte Alban. Look at that big, beautiful courtyard. Obviously, in its current form, it's a little, ruined, but I have no doubt that the fantastic graphic team could doll it up to look as gorgeous as it probably was during the height of Zapotec reign. Let's jump over to a couple potential campaigns for the Zapotecs. Their history features quite a number of very powerful and audacious rulers that could make for some fantastic stories in-game, starting with Cossioesa. This man was a Zapotec emperor during the 1400s during the war with Ahuitzotl. He was known to be a brave and charismatic ruler and successfully defeated the much larger and more dangerous Aztec army on a number of occasions using a combination of alliance, deception, ambush tactics, and similar. According to legend, Ahuitzotl set his beautiful daughter Coyolicansin to seduce Cossioesa, but she turned against her father and fed information to the Zapotecs for the remainder of their marriage. Though Cossioesa was eventually defeated and his people subjugated by the Aztecs for about a decade, he still gave it a valiant effort, and the stories surrounding him are some of the most central ones to Zapotec history. It's a very mythical story, full of romance and heroic fights and daring do and all sorts of lovely stuff. He's an obvious pick, but there's some other good ones to be talked about as well. The second of which being the dynamic father-son duo of Tela and Teolao. Tela was a Zapotec chief of the Sierra Zapotec peoples. The Zapotecs were divided into three subcategories. Valley, Southern, and Sierra. The Sierra ones were in the highest of the highlands and were the most resistant to Spanish rule. And he and his son, Theolao, began to lead a rebellion against the Spanish, gathering a bunch of support among other Zapotec peoples, fighting a number of successful skirmishes, raids, and even pitched battles, and even founding new cities, almost rekindling the Zapotec Empire in its entirety until they were, eventually stomped out by the Spanish. They even fought an entire war versus the Mixtecs during this period. And so in addition to having a nice variety of civilizations, I think that the idea of a father-son rebellion that almost rekindled the entire empire is a very compelling story. Lastly, I want to bring you to substantially earlier in Zapotec history with the great King Zaachila I. This fellow, the founder of the third Zapotec capital, Zaachila, after himself, led his people during that mega drought I was talking about that caused massive influxes of violent wanderers to start to enter Zapotec territory demanding resources. In many ways, I kind of imagine his campaign as being like horde defense, where there's tons of relatively weak enemies, and you have to use your small number of elite troops to gradually fight them off and cede ground a little bit at a time until you can hole up in some of your more powerful fortresses. Even though not as much is known about Zaachila I, he was undeniably very influential in Zapotec history, being the guy who founded their last standing capital, as well as the one who got them through one of the most challenging periods of their history. And so even if some creative liberties had to be taken in his story, I think that he would still make for an excellent campaign protagonist. Moving on, the Zapotecs could possibly feature in a couple of existing campaigns and scenarios, specifically Montezuma I, where you have the 3 rival city-states that you're trying to subjugate. According to the AoE2 wiki, this scenario doesn't have any particular historical meaning and was more meant as a showcase for the new Mesoamerican civs at the time, and so I may as well stick another new Mesoamerican civ in there to round out the group. Additionally, the Dos Pilas scenario, I think, could have some room for a Zapotec player or two amidst the many Mayans that dominate the fairly large map. And beyond that, there really aren't any. It's obviously Mesoamerican civilizations have the major downside of they mostly have to fight amongst themselves, and as such their scenario diversity is fairly limited. But that isn't to say that there aren't some decent options among them. In addition to the campaign protagonists I've already discussed, I'd also like to throw out a special mention to a fellow named Lucano. He was another rebel leader during the Spanish conquest era, and it seems that he tried to lead a pagan revival movement against the Catholic Spaniards. Traditional Mesoamerican paganism lasted much longer in Zapotec territory than it did in other parts of Mexico. And so even though Lucano is relatively minor and there's not a ton known about him, I still think that a pagan revival movement is pretty cool and at least merits a mention in my potential campaign ideas for the Zapotecs. Let's move on to the major themes that I identified while examining Zapotec history. The first of which being that they were the hub of Mexico. They were the Constantinople, the Venice, the Babylon of Mexico for the vast majority of their careers. In many ways, they were the progenitors of culture in Mexico. They seem to have been the ones to invent writing. The Zapotecs called themselves the Beena Za'a, which meant the cloud people. This seems to have referred not only to their place in the highlands and elements of their myths, but also because the Zapotecs very much held themselves above other Mesoamerican peoples and definitely saw themselves as the elites of the region. Additionally, the Zapotecs were the wealthiest empire in Mexico, pretty much right up until the very end of their decline when the Aztecs took that crown from them. But even after the Aztecs ruled, the Zapotec influence over culture and religion in Mexico was absolutely palpable. It's very rare that you see a civilization that retains such a level of hegemony even during its decline, albeit not necessarily on the battlefield. Another major theme I identified was tenacity. The Zapotecs stuck around way longer than they had any right to do. Not only did their decline last for 600 years, but their overall empire lasted 2,000, which is dramatically more than many of the civilizations we see in Age of Empires 2, at the very least. And every single rival that they had, the Mixtecs, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmecs, Teotihuacan, all of them they outlasted. Everyone except for the Spanish. This massive staying power, when coupled with their very fortified cities, was a major part of why I gave them a defensive civilization identity. And lastly, death is a major focal point of Zapotec culture, religion, and even history writ large. Not only was their empire constantly plagued by major droughts and upheavals, but their religion was even more deathy than the other Mesoamerican religions that I'm sure you are used to. Human sacrifice was a big part of it, yes, but they also had a huge focus on ancestor worship, and many of their cities were built on incredibly extensive catacombs, most famously their second capital of Mitla. The duality between tenacity and death is a very interesting part of Zapotec history, and was something I was really hoping to capture in my build for them. I'll leave it up to you to determine whether or not I succeeded in that regard. But with that, we come to the end of our Zapotec history section. If that's all you were here for, thank you so very much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe before you go. And for all the rest of you, let's move on to the game mechanics. How did I choose to build my Zapotec civilization? Before we get into the civilization proper, I encountered a serious problem when designing the Zapotecs, namely how to make them stand out from other Mesoamerican civilizations while their technology trees are so intensely limited, and for good reason. The Mesoamerican civilizations have always been an incredibly awkward place in terms of their tech trees, because on the one hand, they need really full tech trees to compensate for all of the necessary things they miss, like cavalry, but on the other hand, having such broad tech trees feels very ahistorical in many ways, especially when you see the Aztecs, for example, having better siege than half of the European civs. And so my hope with some of these updates was to introduce a couple of new options that were very thematic and historically accurate, that could be stand-ins for some of the old world options that they miss, to allow other elements of their technology trees to be toned down and diversified, which should hopefully allow more different Mesoamerican civs to play in more unique and interesting ways. Not to mention, these stand-ins are very much their own units. Even though they have parallels among old world units, they will all hopefully play differently enough to be a completely unique experience. So with all that preamble aside, let's dive in to the 3 new regional units I am adding for Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Zapotecs, the first of which being the Jaguar Warrior. Now, the Jaguar Warrior, in my estimation, should be a parallel to the Knight line, much in the same way that the Eagle Warrior is a parallel to the Scout line. Yes, Eagle Warriors and Jaguar Warriors were both Aztec specifically, but there were some parallels across many Mesoamerican cultures, and we may as well extrapolate the Jags out in the same way that Age of Empires has traditionally extrapolated out the Eagles to people like the Incans, who definitely did not have them. So in my build, the Jaguar Warrior looks very different from how it looks in the game now. It is now a parallel to the Knight line, that being an expensive, high HP, high power unit that isn't quite as fast as its light cavalry, Eagle Warrior, equivalents. So if we're comparing the Jaguar Warrior to the Knight directly, they have worse HP, they have worse pierce armor, and they have worse speed, but they have just as much melee armor and attack rate, and they have a unique attack bonus versus units below 33% HP. I was kind of trying to capture the Mesoamerican capturing ethos, where warriors would like pounce upon weakened soldiers to take captives to increase their own prestige, and it just kind of feels fitting that a Jaguar themed warrior would be good at like predatorily executing the weak, something like that, and should make them play quite different from the Knight, not to mention helping to compensate for all the things that they are much worse at than the Knight. Now, the Jaguar Warrior is also a bit cheaper than Knight. It costs 70 food and 50 gold, and it is affected by supplies for minus 15 food. However, before you create the Jaguar Warrior, you must install it at the barracks. This would be like a pre-upgrade, kind of like the hand cannoneer used to have way back in Age of Kings. This would be very cheap, but it would take about 45 seconds to research, meaning that you couldn't just start spamming Jags the second you hit Castle Age. You'd have to take a little bit of time to tech into them first. And this was kind of my way of compensating for the fact that you only have to build 2 real military buildings, 3, I guess, as Mesoamerican civs. So this is kind of the stand-in for, I have to build a stable to make knights. No, instead you have to install the Jaguar Warrior first. So the Jag is the first of the new Mesoamerican options, the second of which is the Slinger. Yes, the Incans have it now, but it's dumb that just they have it. Slingers were used everywhere in the world, frankly, but in the Mesoamerican civilizations, they were used everywhere during the AoE2 relevant time frame. Now, my build of the Slinger, again, looks very different from how it looks now. This would be a trash unit to replace the fact that the Meso civs don't have the Hussar. The Slinger would have skirmisher-like stats, but it would have better damage output and speed. The slinger would also have a small attack bonus versus infantry, much less than it has now, where now it's practically a hand cannoneer. I don't want to go that route. But most interestingly, the slinger has a unique property where its attacks cannot deal less than 2 damage, 3 when it's upgraded. Meaning no matter how well armored the opponent is, enough slingers will bring them down. This is in reference to the fact that even Spanish steel plate mail was sorely tested by slingstones during their various invasions, and the Spanish tended to fear the slingers of the Mesoamericans far more than any other ranged projectile being chucked at them. The slinger would only cost 40 food. And though it would be very weak and very susceptible to all sorts of units, especially because, like a skirmisher, it would have a minimum range of 1, that 40 food should allow you to spam it out really nicely, have a hussar-like food dump that you can go into if you want, and though it is, of course, nowhere near a perfect parallel to the hussar, it will kind of fulfill a similar role of being a damage trash unit that is quite good at just outputting a good amount of power as compared to your other trash units, which are really only going to do well against their specific counters. Not to mention, it's a little bit more mobile than either of the other two. Lastly, we have the atlatl. For those who don't know, the atlatl is a kind of spear thrower that you kind of hook a spear into, and it allows you to almost quadruple the range that you can get on a javelin. Both the Aztec and Mayan unique technologies reference the atlatl, and as such, it felt stupid for it not to just be its own unit, especially because the atlatl was used so differently to normal javelineers. In fact, the Mesoamerican peoples didn't often use the atlatl in warfare until the Spanish came around, and then they realized that the atlatl was actually one of their best weapons. Now, the atlatl would be a Castle Age unit. It would be the Mesoamerican equivalent of a cavalry archer, though they'd have many differences. It's slower than a cavalry archer, but still fast. It would obviously have much less HP, and it would also have worse attack and rate of fire, but it would have better accuracy than a cavalry archer, and also critically better range. The atlatl, if you fully upgraded it, would actually be able to even outrange arbalists for normal civilizations. The atlatl also gets a small attack bonus versus cavalry. The atlatl also, though it does not do very much damage, its attacks when they land will pierce like a gulam, damaging whatever other enemy units are about 1 tile behind the original target. This means that the atlatl is especially good against packed cavalry, kind of like when your opponent is blobbing steppe lancers or paladins or something like that. Getting a mess of atlatls to fire in will do a ton of damage to that stack. The atlatl would cost 60 wood and 40 gold, the inverse of a cavalry archer's costs, and like the Jaguar Warrior, it would need to be installed, though it would be very, very cheap to install, and this is pretty much just there as a speed bump to prevent you from just spamming them as soon as you get to Castle Age. Now, in general, all of the existing Mesoamerican civs would need major overhauls to compensate for them gaining these powerful and varied new units, and of course they'd need new unique units to compensate for the ones being lost. I forgot to include these in the presentation, but just to give you a brief breakdown, my idea for a new Aztec unique unit would be the Shorn one. This was the Aztec elite, most of the elite among their military. These would be a gold-intensive heavy infantry unit, slower than a Jaguar Warrior and less tanky, but higher damage, and they would have a unique lifesteal property where they would heal themselves whenever they deal damage. And the Incas would gain a new archery range unique unit, namely the Liwi. This would be a short-ranged bola thrower. For those who don't know, bolas are effectively 2 heavy weights attached by a rope, and they are an entangling projectile. And the Liwi would have fairly low damage, fairly low range, and a minimum range, but would be a trash unit costing wood and a little bit of stone. But very uniquely, its attacks would temporarily entangle an enemy unit, preventing it from moving for like 1 or 2 seconds. And an enemy who was hit by one would not be able to be re-entangled for a couple more seconds. Critically, though, the Liwi would also have an attack bonus versus cavalry and be able to root cavalry for longer than it would be able to root other units. So overall, feels like a good replacement. The bolas were used by the Incan army, and it will allow them to retain their unique identity of having an archer unique unit, in this case one that even factors into their defensive and stone-focused civilization design. With all of those massive necessary updates out of the way, let's finally move on to my build of the Zapotecs proper. We'll start with an overview. The Zapotecs are a defensive and monk civilization. Their first civilization bonus and their landmark bonus is that their university and certain technologies are available an age earlier. This includes things like murder holes, masonry, treadmill crane, the like. Additionally, any Zapotec villager within a university's line of sight gather a little bit faster. You'll want to make sure you get Town Watch and Town Patrol to capitalize on these bonuses. Archaeology seems to indicate that the Zapotecs were the origin of writing, mathematics, and other forms of learning within Central America, and they made great use of implementing this great learning to increase their own wealth and prosperity as a people, hence why I implemented this bonus the way I did. Second civilization bonus. Buildings that Zapotecs place on slopes are constructed 50% faster. And yes, you have to be on the slope itself. You can't just be on the top of a hill. This means that if you are strategic, you can benefit from massive speed improvements in how your villagers construct. Though, since slopes can really screw around with building foundations, this is mostly going to help with small buildings like houses, walls, and towers. The Zapotecs were known to live in the highlands and heavily integrated this unfavorable terrain into their architecture, allowing them to construct much more elaborate buildings than other cultures in the area much earlier in time. Third civilization bonus. The Zapotec monks take half population and automatically convert their killer on death. This includes siege if you have redemption research, so if you get a bunch of monks flattened by a siege onager, you'll grab that siege onager just the same. As mentioned, the Zapotec religion had a major focus on death and ancestor worship. Their elite class, including their monks, were seen as gods or presiding spirits, and as such, their influence could be felt well after death. The fourth civilization bonus is that masonry and architecture benefit both monks and the Zapotec unique unit, giving them plus 10% HP and +1/+1 armor. Zapotecs were well known for inscribing these beautiful, elaborate murals to heroes and religious figures alike, and this bonus is trying to reflect how these elements of their innate building design would reflect in the status and grandeur of their elites being greatly magnified. To round it off, their team bonus makes their monasteries substantially tankier and lets them garrison units, gaining a town center-like multi-arrow projectile in the process. Zapotec temples were the heart of their settlements and were incredibly elaborate in their design. At least one source that I consulted indicated that Zapotec peoples would camp out there during times of crisis as a refuge away from the primary conflict. Moving on to their unique unit, the Zapotecs have, like many other Mesoamerican civs, a very colorful and unusual infantry unique unit, the Macaw Guardian. Now, while this unit is not 100% historically grounded, it is tying together a couple of threads that I found in their history. The Zapotec god of war did take the form of a macaw, and Zapotec infantry was, to the best of our knowledge in the historical record, known to have been slow-moving and heavily armored, as often tasked with protecting their temple complexes as they were with battlefield vanguard duty. They also wielded many of the same weapons as other Mesoamerican cultures, hence me representing them with an Aztec-style axe, or tepoztli. Now, the Macaw Guardian would be an expensive unit, 40 food and 80 gold. That's as much as a Teutonic Knight, but with the cost reversed. And like a Teutonic Knight, they would have incredible defensive stats, though they would have substantially worse damage output and a lot worse melee armor, instead being good against both melee and ranged, especially after you get masonry and architecture online, which should catapult their defenses to absolutely astronomical levels. The Macaw Guardian also has an okay attack bonus against archers, not too much, but enough to make a dent, as well as getting some standard infantry bonuses against eagles and buildings. But most interestingly, the Macaw Guardian has a special ability where enemies who attack it cannot be retasked for 3 seconds. Zapotec infantry would often start battle by taunting and provoking enemy units to try to get them to break ranks and charge before their commanders could organize a proper offensive. And this ability is trying to represent that particular trait in a thematically defensive and impactful manner. Of note, even enemy units that incidentally attack the Macaw Guardian will also be affected by this particular ability. Lastly, the Macaw Guardian has a second ability, giving them plus 33% healing received from all sources, garrisoning, monks, and other. So in summary, though the Macaw Guardian is not a very powerful unit, it can do some good damage, but it takes a while to get there due to its very low speed. It is an incredible pest on the battlefield, being very hard to take down and completely gumming up your enemy's army until it can be killed. Let's move on to their unique technologies. Their Castle Age technology, Pulque, allows their villagers to heal like monks, though about half as effectively. Pulque is the original form of what we now know as mezcal, an agave liquor that originally was used by the Zapotecs extensively in religious rituals. It was also brewed fairly commonly among its peoples and was treated with great reverence. So this technology is representing the Zapotec villagers popping out to offer the boys a little drink in between their various fights. Of note, unlike with monks, Pulque does not stack, so multiple villagers cannot heal the same target, but they will distribute themselves intelligently if you task them to heal or if they're just standing around. The Zapotec's Imperial Age unique technology, Danzantes, makes it so that all units besides siege refund 25% of their cost on death. The danzantes were a set of murals depicting dancing figures, and they were clearly part of the Zapotec ancestral worship culture, probably idolizing former heroes while reaffirming the common people's belief in life after death. As mentioned earlier, if you want any further detail on the specific numbers or contingencies or edge cases of any of these bonuses, check out the Civilization doc linked down in the description below. Let's move on to the tech tree. I liked the format that we tried out last time, and I'm going to commit even further to the Spirit of the Law parallel by giving them letter grades, beginning with infantry. The Zapotecs have a B- for infantry. While they do have the halberdier and the regional jaguar warrior, not to mention their powerful macaw guardian, they are missing champion, squires, and most importantly, blast furnace. So while they have a good amount of variety with their infantry units, their lack of speed and, most importantly, their lack of damage will definitely hold them back from having the same level of impact as more committed infantry civs. Moving on to their archers, it's also a B-. They do have Thumb Ring as well as the two regional Mesoamerican units, but they are missing Arbalester and Bracer. Missing range on your archers is really crippling, and so while they'll be able to pull off archers into crossbows, same as everyone else, once the late game rolls around, they're going to be mostly using their ranged units either as supporting units during trash wars, or if you want to do something fancy with elite atlatls, maybe doing a little bit of hit and run raiding. Their siege is quite bad, a C-. In fact, it might even be more like a D+. They are missing both siege onager and siege ram, as well as siege engineers. Not to mention, siege doesn't benefit from either of their unique technologies. In summary, siege is not something that you're ever going to want to focus on as the Zapotecs, just using it when you absolutely need to bust through enemy fortifications, treb down castles, and the like. So that's a lot of poor grades, but let's move on to the exciting stuff. The Zapotecs have fantastic defenses, an A in my book. Not only do they get the university early, and their monasteries are much tankier, but they have an almost perfect university tech tree, only missing out on Bombard Tower and Siege Engineers. Their Macaw Guardian is also a very defensive unit, as is the unique technology Pulque. Additionally, the Zapotec slope bonus is often going to be a defensively oriented one. And Masonry and Architecture are especially incentivized playing the Zapotecs since they pull double duty with your Macaw Guardians and Monks. We'll get to the Monks in a second because they're one of the most important parts of the Civ, but let's touch upon the economy first. The Zapotecs have a great economy, an A- in my books. Their university bonus, improving gather rates, is going to be huge, allowing for massive boom potential if you can properly defend yourself to capitalize upon it. Their Danzantes technology will also allow them a very strong resource advantage in late game, and their economy tech tree is literally perfect except for two-man saw, which is a bummer to miss, but even with that, I think their other perks easily bring the Zapotecs into A- territory. On to the dock. It's terrible. A D+ in my book. They're missing Fast Fire Ship, they're missing Bracer as mentioned earlier, and they don't have Dry Dock or Shipwright. Though I should note that Danzantes will affect ships, so in late game grindy scenarios, maybe they'll have a little bit of an impact on certain water maps. But their monks are some of the best in the game. They have their Masonry and Architecture to make their monks substantially tankier, the monastery itself is a lot tankier, and their Macaw Guardian has some innate synergies with monks, not only being healed faster, but also, very importantly, keeping enemy units off of your monks to give them time to pull off a conversion. They also have a perfect monastery tech tree, and their strong innate half population and automatic conversion monk bonus. So you can see why I labeled the Zapotecs as a defensive and monk civilization. But that's not to say those are the only strategies they can pull off. Let's take a quick look at their playstyle, how I envision the Zapotecs would often go about a game in the hands of a skilled player. Well, starting off with the early game, you are typically going to want to wall up And boom, unsurprisingly. Come Feudal Age, if you actually can afford a university, that can give you a huge acceleration into your castle age. But as mentioned, that's not the only thing you can do as the Zapotecs. You also have normal rushes available to you. You have militia into man-at-arms, just the same as everyone else. You have archers into crossbows, just the same as everyone else. And once you hit castle age, you can do some funky stuff with your Mesoamerican regional units. Once you hit the mid-game as the Zapotecs, however, you start to get a lot more options opening up to you. One of the strongest options you have is a slow push, using tanky units like the Macaw Guardian, forward villagers building quick castles on slopes and healing people up with pulque, and making extensive use of your powerful Mesoamerican regional guys. Monk siege pushes are very, very strong in Castle Age for the Zapotecs, because their siege is still going to be plenty good before Imperial Age starts to roll around, and their monks are obviously exceptional. You can even do something really funky where you forward your monastery, garrison villagers inside of it, and kind of use it like a tower rush at the same time that it is churning out monks to convert people. Though I'm talking mostly about aggression here, you can still just boom up in Castle Age. Your universities will only get more line of sight and only increase your gather rate further. And so on maps like Arena, there will be very little stopping you from accumulating a massive resource advantage before troops really start to hit the field. The late game is a mixed bag for the Zapotecs. On the one hand, you have exceptional endurance. Danzantes alone will allow you to outproduce many opponents and become very resource efficient, but you are extremely gold dependent, as your trash is mediocre overall with very low damage output, and literally all of your power units are incredibly demanding on the gold front. Even though a slow push is typically going to be how you want to close out the game as the Zapotecs, you can still do some raiding with your fast Mesoamerican specific units. I completely forgot to mention in the tech tree section, you actually miss Elite Eagle Warrior as the Zapotecs. And so your best raiding units are going to be the Elite Jaguar and the Elite Atlatl, especially the Elite Atlatl, because your Jaguars won't have access to squires. And so you won't have nearly the same level of mobility as many other Mesoamerican civilizations, but you can still get a little bit of work done, especially if your opponent is focusing on a spammy trash war frontline. Thus concludes my analysis of hypothetical Zapotec playstyle, but before we conclude the presentation, let's end off, as always, with a couple of loose threads. Ideas that didn't quite make it in, and questions that are still lingering in my mind. Let's begin with some of those questions. I am obviously proposing a ton of very impactful Mesoamerican changes with this particular build. And as is always the case with major changes to existing civilizations, there is always the risk of it being too overwhelming for casual players and too controversial for entrenched players. So while I think it is a very important part of what will allow Mesoamerican civ design to be as varied and engaging as we need it to going forward, I could see it being disliked by some. Additionally, I think that the Zapotecs slope bonus is a big unknown. It could really be either incredible or terrible, and I have no idea. This kind of applies to my build of the Zapotecs overall. I have no idea whether like the university gather bonus will just blow them out of the water in terms of how strong it is, or whether they'll just flounder and die to any aggression that their opponent sends at them pre-castle. It's a big question mark for me. And lastly, Danzantes in particular feels like it could be really warping in post-Imperial Age. I did consider it just refunding gold instead of refunding all resources, so if people thought it was too much, that's a change I would be very willing to make. On to the fun stuff. Let's talk about some tabled ideas. To begin, I had the idea that all Zapotec units would have bonus line of sight, and their line of sight would linger for like 5 to 10 seconds after death. Is it cool? Yes. Is it thematic? Kinda plays into the death theme, and they were a Highland people, so they could see pretty far. But it's kind of random and feels pretty weak. So I wanted to focus on some more impactful, defining bonuses rather than little funky ones like this. I also had the idea that universities would give you a trickle of gold, but would take population space. I think that the gather rate bonus more elegantly addresses the history behind this particular idea, but it was one that passed my mind. I do know, though, that trickle buildings are somewhat controversial, and many people really dislike infinite resources, so while I am a proponent of both of those things, I'm happy to save those particular topics for future builds. I also had an idea where you could sacrifice villagers at the monastery to boost your nearby farms. Very cool, pretty thematic, but largely mythical in nature. Not to mention it would have a lot of moving parts, which just kind of overcomplicates the process of getting a little bit more food. I also had an idea where your farms could count as elevation, so if you shoot off of them, it does bonus damage. It's because they build terrace farms. Get it? It's dumb. It's just very, very random bonus. I also had the idea where enemies could not build within the line of sight of a monastery. And this bonus I really liked. It felt like a great way to kind of describe the religious hegemony that the Zapotecs imposed, not to mention referencing some of the kind of cleansing rituals that were a part of their religion when they were establishing new temple sites. But it did feel a little underpowered in most circumstances and could lend itself to some really annoying cheese if you did like a forward monastery drop that you could then garrison villagers inside and prevent your enemies from building around. Playing into the monk theme, I also thought that monks could refund their cost. This would be another kind of on-death bonus, and I had a few of those at the time. So it felt like too much death, and I decided to go with the ones I felt were a little bit stronger, but this was definitely a strong contender for me. And I also had the idea that they could get stone walls in the Dark Age. So university technologies being available in Age earlier kind of addressed this particular idea. They can actually get fortified walls in Feudal Age, by the way. So that's one of the technologies you can get in Age early through your university bonus. And lastly, this was probably my favorite bonus I didn't use. Attacking a Zapotec monastery would, in an original build, harm the attacker. Incredibly cool. I'm definitely using this one in Teotihuacan unless I think of a much better idea. It plays into the idea of religious dominance as well as like superstition and people not wanting to attack a given religious building for fear of being smote down by some fearsome pagan god. I just absolutely love the theming. But with them already having tankier monasteries, this just felt absolutely overwhelming. Moving on to some unique units and technologies, I had the idea for a warrior priest style unit called the Cacique. It would be able to convert, and other than that, be a fairly standard heavy infantry. Is it thematic? I think so, but I liked the Macaw Guardian a lot better. You know me, I like complicated, funky, weird units, and it felt like the Macaw Guardian kind of tied in all of the theming of the Zapotecs while being really colorful and stand out. I think it would have a really gorgeous model in game, and those sort of aesthetic draws definitely play a role in my decision making personally. For unique technologies, I did consider poison weapons. I know many people have advocated for this on all manner of civilizations in the past. In this particular instance, it would be a basic damage over time for all gold costing units. Felt a little generic and not really in theme for the civilization, so I decided to dodge it for this particular build. I had another unique technology called death masks, where whenever a unit was killed, the killer would have their attack drop for a substantial period of time. Another one that I was very, very close to using, as I mentioned for the refunding bonus earlier, it just felt like there were too many on-death bonuses going on, and this was definitely my least favorite among them. So I'm going to save this for a future civilization. As with all my tabled ideas, keep a weathered eye out for these in some of my future videos. And with that, at long last, we come to the end of this monster of a build. Thank you guys so much for watching. Before we round off for today, let's take a look at the good old likeLyometer. In my humble opinion, how likely is it on a scale of 1 to 10 that the Zapotecs would be implemented in the game and maybe even look a little bit like what I have for them here? And today on the likeLyometer we have a 6 out of 10. Do I think new Mesoamerican civs will be added? I think it's a distinct possibility, not a high likelihood possibility, hence a 6 out of 10, but if Meso civs were added, I think the Zapotecs are probably the top of the list, along with the Mixtecs. And if they were implemented, even if the DE team decided not to go with any new regional units to add strategic diversity, I think one of the best ways to make the Zapotecs distinct from the other Meso civs would be to give them a defensive-oriented identity, similar to what I have here. And at last, we are at the end. Please tell me, friends, how did you like my build? What would you have done differently? Are there any elements of the history that I missed? Are there any balance points that are just horribly out of whack? Is there anything I did that you particularly liked? I would love to hear all of that and more down in the comments, especially if you have any ideas on what civilization, unit, Age of Empires theory crafting topic in general you'd like to see me tackle next. With all that being said, I thank you once again for taking the time out of your day to watch, and as always, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.